back on day one of creation. We considered two questions, the question of extraterrestrial life, along with the question of man's exploration of space, outer space that is, both of which are dealt with in the Scriptures. If we want to take the plain, simple statement of truth and fact there in Psalm 115, the heaven belongs to the Lord, but the earth hath he given to the children of men, would inform us that the earth belongs to us, but the heavens belong to him. Now, in the first verse of Genesis, which is what we've been looking at here for some time, we see this twofold creation of the heavens and of the earth. Now, immediately after verse 1, Moses, in giving this account to us, regardless of whether he used sources or not, we know that he's the one that penned what we've got from Genesis chapter 1. Immediately after leaving verse 1, he drops the subject of the heavens entirely, because from verse 2 on through the rest of the Bible, but especially on through the rest of the creation account, we see him majoring on the second thing that we've talked about there in the first verse of Genesis, and that is the earth. And this, of course, is due to the place of prominence that the earth has, insofar as this is man's abode, and this is where the plan and working out of redemption will be seen, of course, manifested in the substitutionary work of Christ on the cross. Therefore, God doesn't tell us just a whole lot about the heavens, but he goes on right into verse 2, and he's picking up the subject of the earth, and he does go on to tell us a whole lot about the earth. Now, this is not because Moses is geocentric in thought as opposed to heliocentric. It's simply because of the reason I just gave you, the prominent place the earth has with regard to the salvation and the redemption of man. Now, even when we get down to the remarks made in verses 14 through 19, which constitute the fourth day of creation, and during which we see the luminaries placed in the second heaven, even here it would appear to some that Moses is now reverting back to the first subject of Genesis 1:1, and that is the creation of the heavens. But really, on a closer scrutiny, this is not true, because if you'll look at verse 15, his subject is still the earth. And let them, he's speaking of the luminaries that he mentioned in verse 14, let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so. So his primary concern now, as soon as he finishes verse 1 of Genesis, is to give us an account of the creation of the earth and its formation and its filling up with population. And this is why we have to not really guess, but we have to use some reasoning to figure out different things about the stars and the various galaxies, the other things that we'll be looking at down on the fourth day of creation. But you see, those things aren't included here. And that's because God wants us to see that he's concerned about the earth. Not any other planet here. Again, showing the priority of the earth. Not any other planet, but just the earth. This is what he's concerned about, and this is what he's going to deal with in these remaining verses in the creation account. Now, does anyone here have another version besides King James? I assume most of you do, so you can follow what we're saying. Well, you know, I told you earlier that the word heaven there in verse 1 is plural, and it should be pluralized in your English version. And many, if not most, of your English versions, I just looked up the NASB before I came, and it gives you the plural there, so I'm not telling you something that's new. It's just something the King James translators didn't put in here. But many, if not most, of your other versions will already have this word in the plural for you. You see, this is the trouble, this gets into another subject, but this is the trouble with Bible translations. And I guess this is why you don't, why I certainly wouldn't want to translate the Bible, because besides just having to know something about the language, or you got to know a lot about the languages of the Bible, you've got to know a lot about what he's trying to get across here, or you would know whether to put it in the singular or whether to put it in the plural, regardless of whether you knew Hebrew or not, because Hebrew is going to always give it to you in the plural. But whenever you come over into the English now, you see you've got to make up your mind. Now, should this be in the plural or should this be in the singular? And this is the trouble that Bible translators have, and this is why no translations anywhere at any time are ever identically the same. And even if we go back to the Greek and Hebrew, the various manuscripts, since we don't have the autographs, none of them are exactly the same either. So we have to determine just in the context and in other places where the same subject is covered in the Bible, how we should be translating these various things. Now, because we are going rather slow here in the creation account, is why we're taking time to give some of these things to you. We're not going to try to give you every word here and how it should be. Just like we can't run through the whole Bible and give you all the hundreds of times you're going to see the word heaven and sit there and try to figure out, now, should it be the singular or should it be the plural? That'll be up to you to find out every time you come across the word heaven. Now, should that be singular or should that be plural? That'll give you something interesting to do for the rest of your life as you're reading the Old Testament. Because it takes a study of the context there to determine, now, is this singular or is this plural? Now, when we get over to the Greek, see, that's a different word than we've got in the Hebrew. It seems like it's uranos over in the Greek, which would be singular, but they can give it to us plural if that's what they think it should be in the plural. That depends on what the manuscript is going to have. But because the Hebrew is always plural, we have to make that own distinction ourselves. Having said that, this brings us to verse 2 of Genesis. Now, recall your attention to the fact that we've already dealt 4 times with verse 2 of Genesis because it's such an important verse. And we want to look at this evening 4 interpretations of verse 2 of Genesis 1, 4 of the most popular ones, one of which, the last of which, will be the biblical view. But there are so many views about this verse because it stands in a peculiar relationship to verse 1, and just what that peculiar relationship is, people do not know. Remember that verse 1 stands both as the first act in creation and also as a caption or as a summary for what's going to follow. And since, as we've already shown you, verse 2 is really connected to verse 1 because it's subordinate to and explanatory of verse 1, then verse 2 would stand in a similar relation with the rest of the verses in Genesis 1. So let's look right now at some various interpretations of Genesis 1:2, some of the popular ones. The first one is known as the chaos view. This is the view of most of your liberal scholars, and they feel that verse 2 here in Genesis 1 represents the eternal chaos that's been eternally existent with God, with which God is having to more or less wrestle, as in a tug-of-war, to bring some type of order and some type of symmetry out of this eternal chaos that has always been there. And you'll read this in a lot of writings, and so many of your, at least your modern theologians, if not consciously, at least subconsciously, they've been influenced by Milton's great literary piece, Paradise Lost, in which we find 2 lines that say this, in the beginning, how the heavens and the earth rose out of chaos. Now, that's a direct quote from Milton's Paradise Lost. How many of you have read Paradise Lost before? Some of you have? It's something that you ought to read because it has such an influence on so much of our weak churchianity and our weak denominational concepts of Christianity and everything else. It goes hand in hand with Dante's Inferno. How many of you have ever read Dante's Inferno? Same thing there. A lot of things there. Of course, Dante's Inferno teaches the JDS heresy, for one thing. And so these 2 writings here, Milton's Paradise Lost, both of these are classics in literature. And if you've been to college, and you probably had to study something like that. But anyway, here in Milton's Paradise Lost, which he gives an account of some of the things of creation and especially the Adam and Eve story with regard to the forbidden fruit. A lot of fanciful notions, the apple tree and so forth, that people just subconsciously have picked up from writings of these geniuses like Milton or like a Shakespeare or like a Dante or someone like that. And it's here in this writing that we have the quote, in the beginning, how the heavens and the earth rose out of chaos. It's because this evidently is what Milton, how he viewed the Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2 account here, that God is wrestling with eternal chaos to bring some type of order or symmetry out of it. Now, in the very beginning, or back many centuries ago, the word chaos didn't have, well, of course, when we use the word, it has nothing but a negative and evil connotation to it. Chaos speaks of utter ruin and destruction and so forth. And the word originally didn't have that connotation. It was simply meant out of order, something that was out of order. And this is what the earth is at this point. It's still unfinished, in other words, at this point. And so many of your liberal scholars, if not most of your liberal scholars, will fall along this line of believing in the chaos view of Genesis 1-2. A second view is known as the restitution or the reconstruction view. And it's also known more recently as the gap theory. And since we taught 4 teachings on the gap theory, we won't go into much detail on this, but to give you some of the names of the men that hold to this view, so you can spot it in their writings if you come across their writings. I'm just going to give you their last names now, and most of these I think I've given you before, and you should know of whom I'm speaking. First of all, Dr. Chalmers, Pember, Schofield, Custance, Morgan, even the great G. Campbell Morgan that wrote so many devotional books that people read today, Thiessen, Arthur Pink, then Dake, and then 2 other men, Unger and Waltke, that of course are a little bit different than the norm in the gap theorist camp, because they put the gap before verse 1 rather than after verse 1. Unger and Waltke are different than the other ones because they put this great gap before verse 1. And of course, this is the gap, allegedly, where we can now reconcile the so-called historical geology with the revealed truths here in the Mosaic account of creation, during which time Satan fell, the dinosaurs became extinct, we have our coal and petroleum formed. This is when the fossils were laid down in the various strata of the earth and so forth, which of course we're not going to even say anything else about. You can go back and hear the other 4 tapes to hear a refutation of that. Thirdly, another modern view here. Chaos is an ancient and a modern view, as is restitution or the ruin and reconstruction. But a more modern view is known as the nothing view. Some empty heads invented it too. First of all, 2 men here, they start off with the same premise, I guess you could say, and that is the nothingness of Genesis 1-2, but they end up with different conclusions. But we'll lump them together. First of all, Karl-Heinz Rabist, K-A-R-L-H-E-I-N-Z. That's one name. Karl-Heinz Rabist, R-A-B-A-S-T. And Karl Barth, B-A-R-T-H. The latter is the more well-known of the 2. Now, I don't know whether this is necessarily true of Barth here, but I know because I've read some of what Karl-Heinz Rabist had to say. I know that he rejected, this is interesting, that Rabist rejected the gap theory or the restitution or the ruin and reconstruction view simply on the basis of the fact he didn't feel that Scripture would pass over this much material as well as this great a time period totally in silence without telling us anything about it. Now that's what's known as an argument from silence, and those aren't nearly as strong as an argument that you can substantiate with, say, proof text from the Bible. But that's something that we gave you earlier. Even though it's an argument from silence, it's a valid argument that the Bible's not going to pass over this much material because it's here and we've got the great fall of Satan and everything. It's not going to pass over this if this did occur between Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2. And all these other things we have happening, plus billions and billions of years, it's not going to pass over that in silence. And then with the genealogies in chapters 5 and 11 of Genesis, lead us to the misconception that the earth is only several thousand years old. Because, of course, obviously, when we take the Bible for just what it says and we study these genealogies, and we haven't been imbued by men with this deception about the gap theory, we come up with the fact that the earth can only be several thousand years old. Now, if there was a gap in between the first two verses of Genesis, then more or less God's able to deceive us here because he didn't tell us there's a gap there. And as we showed you grammatically and scripturally and sensibly, there couldn't be a gap in between the first two verses of Genesis because they go together. And that means chapters 5 and chapters 11, taken in consideration with things like Matthew 1 and the genealogy in Luke, let us know that the earth can only be several thousand years old. Now, to try to put how many thousands of years old upon it is to miss the point of the genealogies and to miss the point of what I'm saying here. It doesn't tell us how many thousands of years old, but it tells us definitely that it's not millions of years old. It's not even hundreds of thousands of years old. It's not even tens of thousands of years old. I mean, it could go up to 90,000 years. That would be tens of thousands. And understanding the genealogies here let us know that this simply cannot be the case. Now, what they say here, especially, well, both of them say this because, as I said, they start off with the same premise here, is that Genesis 1:2, remember the chaos view, this represented eternal chaos. Well, Genesis 1:2 represents the indescribable eternal nothingness. Now, if it's indescribable, then how do we get this description of it in verse 2? That's the first thing to ask. Now, this is directly from both of their writings, especially Karl Heinz's writings. This represents the indescribable eternal nothingness. So, of course, they knew that someone would come along and say, well, if it's indescribable, then why is it described here in Genesis 1:2? And what they say is, well, it's indescribable, but God wanted to at least give us some idea of what it would be like if he could describe it to us. And so this is what we have in Genesis 1:2. And that's why it's called the nothing view, because the view has nothing to it, no substance to it. As E.J. Young has said of this, it represents and is characteristic of so much irrationalism in 20th century scholastic circles today, whenever these men go back to the first 11 chapters of Genesis and try to reason out what is said here. As a matter of fact, Karl Barth, in his monumental series, Church Dogmatics, which, of course, even though Barth is a neo-Orthodox theologian, he's probably the greatest theologian of this century. Now, he's not an American, he's from Europe. But in his series, Church Dogmatics, where he deals with all the doctrines of the Bible, he even calls Genesis 1:2 what he calls the crux interpretum, which he says is one of the most difficult verses in all of the Bible to interpret, Genesis 1:2. Now, that's said by perhaps the greatest theologian of this century. The greatest thinkers, modern theological minds of this century, calls Genesis 1:2 the crux interpretum, because he said it is such a difficult verse to be able to interpret correctly, and in order for you to be sure that you've interpreted it correctly. So no doubt we need to be spending as much time as we have been here on the verse, because if Karl Barth says that it's one of the most difficult verses in the Bible, then it probably is. And with all that people have said about it, it must be. I mean, to me it doesn't seem too difficult, but it must be to everyone else, because no one believes the biblical view. or few people, I should say, believe the biblical view, which is our fourth view here of what Genesis 1:2 is all about, and that is Genesis 1:2, the biblical view, is that it speaks of the primeval earth in its unfinished form. Now, how many of you were taught this from your church, that this is what verse 2 represented, the earth in its unfinished form? One or two people here? Most people, you see, don't realize that. They just read right through Genesis 1 and never realize that the earth was created in a state in which it does not exist today, and that's even disregarding the Noachian deluge, too. We know that's changed things. But I'm talking about in the very beginning, that the earth was made in a state in which we do not find it today. I know I was brought up naively thinking the earth was made like the earth, with as many seas as we have, or oceans as we have, and the 7 continents that we have, a North Pole, a South Pole, spinning on its axis, 71% water, 29% land, with the various spheres of the atmosphere and so forth. Now, a little deeper study, just a little deeper study right here in Genesis 1 disproves all those things that I gave you right there, because we find right here already in Genesis 1:2 that the earth covered with water. And most people don't realize that. Now, if they would take Genesis 1, this isn't even something you've got to study out here. This is plainly taught down in verses 9 and 10, where we have to get dry land out of what's been covered by water for 2 days now. Been totally covered by water. The verse over in Isaiah 45:18 clearly intimates that this is the biblical view, that Genesis 1:2 represents the primeval earth in its unfinished form. Isaiah 45:18. Remember, this is a verse that, if properly understood, goes right hand in hand with the biblical view of Genesis 1:2, that God didn't create the earth to remain in an unfinished form. And if this is what Isaiah is saying, then we have to go back to Genesis 1 and find, well, where is that place where the earth existed in an unfinished form? And it exists that way in Genesis 1:2. For thus saith the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it. He hath established it. He created it not in vain, but he formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is none else. And what he's saying here is that he didn't create the earth to remain in an unfinished state. And as soon as you understand that, now you see, most people are taking Isaiah 45:18 and trying to use that to prove the gap theory, so they're going to be missing the point of why he said that and of how that relates correctly with Genesis 1:2. But as soon as you understand that that's what Isaiah is saying there, or what God is saying, thus saith the Lord that created the heavens, is what Isaiah tells us, that I didn't create the earth to remain in an unfinished state, then immediately we would have to go back to Genesis 1 and try to find that time whenever the earth existed in an unfinished state. And this is what we find in Genesis 1 and verse 2. And consequently, this is the scriptural, biblical view of correctly interpreting this verse, that it speaks of the primeval earth in its unfinished form. Then he's going to go on and finish it by forming it and then by populating it. You might want to get this down. I want to give you another translation of Genesis 1:2. It's more than a paraphrase, because you'll find at least similar translations in other versions of the Bible where they understand that the wall here in Genesis 1:2, the and there, it's not a wall consecutive, but that it's a wall copulative, disjunctive, and whenever they understand that, then they're able to give us something a little better than what the King James translators have given us. Okay, a translation, Genesis 1:2. Now as far as the earth was concerned, it was unformed and unfilled. That's what tohu vabohu means. Unformed and unfilled. Now, as far as the earth was concerned, it was unformed and unfilled. And darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering or brooding upon the face of the waters. Now, even the word face there is really plural, but it's a plural of intensity. But you can leave it singular and it'll mean the same thing. Now, as far as the earth was concerned, it was unformed and unfilled. Now, this is all that Genesis 1:2 is saying. As far as the earth was concerned. Which earth? The earth he just mentioned in verse 1. What was it like? It was unformed and it was unfilled. What else about it? Darkness covered the face of the deep. What else about it? And the Spirit of God was hovering or brooding over or upon the face of the waters. Now, what we get in this translation of Genesis 1:2 is a five-fold description of the primeval earth. Now, primeval simply means the original or the ancient earth. A five-fold description we're given here in this translation of the primeval earth. That is the description of the earth in its original state whenever it was created. Looking out on the earth today tells us nothing whatsoever about the way in which it was made. If for no other reason, 2 Peter 3 tells us that there's been a change. And that's, of course, due to the flood. And, of course, when we go back to Genesis 1 rather than Genesis 6 and go a little bit earlier, we find there's more changes due to more things besides just the flood, and that is further creation work of God. Again, changes the earth and its topography from the way that we find it here on the first day in the first verse of the first book of the Bible. Now, this fivefold description is as follows. First of all, the earth is unformed. Now, this does not mean that it has no form to it whatsoever, because every visible thing has some type of form to it. Even if you just spill water on the concrete and it just goes all over the place, it's still got some type of form to it. So the earth has some type of form, but what this means is it does not have its finished form, or that is its intended form for God to have. And so Moses gives us the account that the earth at this time was unformed. It did not have the intended form that it's going to assume throughout the remaining 5 days of the creation week. Then secondly, in the description of the earth, it was unfilled. Now, we explain this in the same way we do explaining the word or the description of the earth as being unformed. Unfilled insofar as it's not filled with the things that it in the future is intended to be filled with. At this time, it's filled with water. The whole earth is covered and filled with water. So we can't take unfilled in a strictly literal sense in its totality, because how can you have the earth that's unfilled when it's filled with water all at the same time? So it lacks the inhabitants, whether they're human or plant or animal or otherwise. It lacks the inhabitants that God is going to put on it in the future. What you get here with just these two words is the imagery of a potter trying to make something out of a piece of clay. And he'll start off just with a lump of clay. And he can say, now that clay is unformed and unfilled. This is what God starts off with here on the very beginning. Now he has to create the earth like the potter begins to start off with a piece of clay. He doesn't create the clay, but he's going to start off with it. God differs insofar as he creates what he's going to begin to work with. But once that potter gets that piece of clay, then he's going to have to work it into some type of form, and then maybe he wants to fill it up with some type of figures or some type of writing that he's going to begin drawing on there. So he'd say, in the beginning I had a piece of clay, but it was unformed and unfilled. And we wouldn't say, that represents Satan's fall and Lucifer's flood and total destruction. We'd simply say, he's not finished yet. And we've got 6 more days, 5 more in creation, plus the 7th day. So we've got to give God time to get finished here. So people have just in the back of their mind assumed that he just zapped and everything was here, but we've got 6 days that he does all of these things. Not just on one day in an instant of time makes everything. If we could say that the potter, don't criticize him yet, don't laugh at what he's done, don't pass judgment upon it, he's not finished yet, then why can't we say the same thing about God? Don't pass judgment on the world here. God's not finished with what he's going to do. Unformed, unfilled. Thirdly, we see that the earth is covered with darkness. And no, this is not symbolical of evil here. Darkness is simply the absence of light. Darkness is not something created. Darkness is nothing. Light is something that has to pierce darkness in order for you to be able to see. Now, when he goes on the same day, verse 3, to create light, then we have a division now between light and darkness. But God couldn't help if there was darkness. Darkness isn't anything. Light is something that has to come in and dispel the darkness there. In other words, darkness is merely the absence of light. So it doesn't represent any form of judgment. Then fourthly, in a description of the primeval earth. Now you need to remember these things because this is what your earth was like when it was first created. I mean, even later on the first day, we have one of these things changed, the description, namely darkness has changed. But at the very beginning, this is what the earth looked like. Fourthly, it was covered with water. Now we have 2 words for that here in Genesis 1:2. The earth was unformed and unfilled, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Now that's the word tehom, T-E-H-O-M, which refers to water, a great depth of water. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. That's the word mayim, M-A-Y-I-M. And it means just that, waters. And of course you can tell it's plural for waters. So we have twice that he's told us now. If you didn't understand what the deep meant, that's what the word means. It refers to water here, a great depth of water. As far as we know, the earth is from core outwards, and from outward into the core is nothing but water. Now, of course, it's got gas along with it. Well, what is water? What is water, someone? What? H2O, 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. So it's nothing but gas. It's all water is. We just get it in a liquid form there. So that tells us right away, whenever we've got this, see, right away, as long as you know just that basic elementary chemistry truth there, that water is H2O, 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen, you know we've got more than water here. We've got to have gases here. So see, God doesn't tell us now, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth and gases. Just hundreds and hundreds of things he leaves out here. Some of them we can fit in ourselves, most of them we can't. I mean, we could tell maybe what day they were made on, but what gas was created first? Or were all gases created at the same time? Well, we're not told that. But this will right away let us know that we've got liquid here, basically water. The whole earth is one big ball of water. It's got gases mixed in with it. And if you'll turn over to Proverbs 8, there are also solid particles, howbeit small ones, that make up the earth's composition. This is what we're looking at now, the earth's composition from your outline. Proverbs 8 and verse 26. While as yet he had not made the earth, nor the fields, nor the highest part of the dust of the world. And that's just speaking of the very, very beginning there. It doesn't mean high away from the earth's surface. It means the chief part of the dust of the earth. So in the very beginning, we've got gases, we've got liquids, we've got solids that, when mixed together, form one liquid ball. And again, evidently, we've got gravity already taking place here, or everything would just go everywhere. So that has already been put into operation here in order to hold the earth together, or it would just begin to separate all over the place. So you've got gravity here in the very beginning, along with these dust particles. Now I want to give you some verses that we want to look at that use the same word tehom, T-E-H-O-M, for the deep. Genesis 7:11, the fountains of the great deep broke up in the flood. Genesis 49, let me see what verse. We'll look at these. This is the blessing here by Jacob, the patriarch Jacob, on his son Joseph. You see in verse 22 of Genesis 49, he's speaking of Joseph. He's going from one son to the next, and he's on the next to last one. The last one will be Benjamin on down there. He's on Rachel's children here. So he's on Joseph. Verse 23, the archers have sorely grieved him and shot at him and hated him. But his bow abode in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From thence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Even by God, by the God of thy father, who shall help thee, and by the Almighty, who shall bless thee, with blessings of heaven above, and blessings of the deep that lieth under. Now, some people feel that he's speaking of under the earth, so how can he refer to water here? Well, we've got many, many subterranean springs, and you've got whole rivers that flow underground. And in places like the Near East, where you don't have a lot of water, you need water that's somewhere close to the surface so you can do what? Dig a well and be able to reach the water. So this is talking about waters here. It happens to be under the earth's surface here, but it uses that same word deep. That doesn't just mean deep down in the earth, it means deep down in there until you come to water. Job 38 and verse 30. The waters are hid as with a stone, and the face of the deep is frozen. Talking about water again. Psalm 104:6. Thou coverest it with the deep as with a garment, and the waters stood above the mountains. Psalm 135:6. Look at this verse here, Psalm 135:6. Whatsoever the Lord pleased, that did he in heaven and in earth, in the seas and all deep places. Because, of course, the sea can be very, very deep. As a matter of fact, well, I think this is true. I don't have the exact figure here, but the highest mountain on the earth, which is Mount Everest in Nepal, Tibet border, 29,000 feet, is smaller than the deepest place in the ocean, which is the Mariner Trench. Now you think of how high 29,000 feet is. That's a long way up. But the ocean at one point is deeper than the highest mountain that rises up on the surface of the earth. So when he says just seas, that could be a sea that's, say, 1,000 feet deep. That's the average for all the oceans. They're an average of 1,000 feet deep. But what about when you get down to 31,000 feet deep? Well, it's just, of course, no person could go down there. The pressure of water would just be so tremendous. Just if you've ever dived to the bottom of a deep swimming pool, whenever you're a child, to bring up a coin or something, and what does that do to your eardrums when you get down there? That stings your eardrums. And you see, if you go very deep, it'll burst your eardrums because of the pressure of water on top of you. That's why you have to have things like a submarine that's pressurized inside that can go down there. But even it's not going to go down to 31,000 feet, though. So that's deeper than just the sea. This is all deep places. So this is very, very deep. And see, remember now, it uses this word referring to the earth here in Genesis 1:2. And the earth, let's say from the United States all the way through to China, is nothing but water. So that would certainly be the word you'd want to use there, deep, rather than just seas or oceans, to let you know that it's deep there. Proverbs 8:28. Now this uses the word fountains, just like Genesis 7:11 did, that the fountains of the great deep were broken up in Noah's flood. When he established, now a lot of this, of course, a lot of chapter 8, it's a personification of wisdom in the form of Christ here, but it has a lot to do with the eternality of the Son of God as existing before God's creation. And this is what he's explaining here in many places, creation. When he established the clouds above, and when he strengthened the fountains of the deep. The same word. Isaiah 51:10. I think I'm giving you just about all of the places where this appears. I think it appears one other time in Psalms, in the book of Psalms that I didn't write down. But this is most of the places where you'll see this word appear. Isaiah 51:10. Art thou not it which hath dried the sea, the waters of the great deep, that hath made the depths of the sea a way for the ransom to pass over? Ezekiel 26:19. For thus saith the Lord God, when I shall make thee a desolate city like the cities that are not inhabited, when I shall bring up the deep upon thee, and great waters shall cover thee. You always see Mayim, or many times you see Mayim right along with Tehom to let you know that the deep is simply another word for water. Generally, it just refers to a deeper aspect of the seas or of the oceans. Then in Habakkuk's little prophecy, Habakkuk 3 and verse 10. Habakkuk 3:10, the mountains saw thee, and they trembled. The overflowing of the water passed by, and the deep uttered his voice. Oh, I remember that other verse now. We'll finish this. The mountains saw thee, and they trembled. The overflowing of the water passed by. The deep uttered his voice and lifted up his hands on high. The other one is back in Psalms. I'll have to just find which psalm that is. I know why I didn't put it down, because we're going to look at this in another message, but I can find the verse, though, because I know where it is on the page. Psalm 42. What do you think this verse means? Psalm 42 and verse 7. Psalm 42 goes right along with Psalm 43. They hardly should be divided here because these two psalms go together. Psalm 42:7, deep calleth unto deep at the noise of thy waterspouts, and all thy waves and thy billows are gone over me. Well, you can think about that before we get to that. What does that mean? Deep calleth unto deep at the noise of thy waterspouts. The Bible just gives us all types of good scientific information if we understand what he's saying. And then over in the New Testament, now we're going to get a different word here, but in 2 Corinthians 11, what many of our opponents say where Paul missed it, because if he was going with God, he wouldn't be suffering all these persecutions and trials here. Seems like somewhere the Bible says, yea, and all that live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer some of these things. 2 Corinthians 11. Well, we can start with verse 23. Are they ministers of Christ? He's defending his apostolic authority. I speak as a fool, I'm more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths all. Of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. Thrice was I beaten with rods, once was I stoned, thrice I suffered shipwreck, a night and a day have I been in the deep. So he's just picking up the same imagery from the Old Testament there, and he must mean he was out in the water floating around somewhere, which we know he did in the end of Acts 27. Now what the liberals try to do, you'll come across this in some of your readings, is relate this word tehom to the Babylonian goddess Tiamat, T-I-A-M-A-T, who was the goddess of saltwater oceans and seas. And of course what they're trying to do is relate the Genesis account to the Babylonian account, which is known as Enuma Elish, and say that the Hebrews borrowed their account of creation from the Babylonians, and this word right here, you see both of these words can be traced back to the same Semitic base, the same Semitic root word here for Tehom and Tiamat, and they say, well, evidently they must have borrowed it because she happens to be the goddess of salt waters. And here this is what the word means, or it means water. It doesn't tell us, though, does it mean salt waters or fresh water here. And you see the Babylonians had another god who was a male god. She was the goddess, Tiamat, but they had a male god, and he was god of all fresh water. So if they've taken this word here, then all we've got is salt water here, and we wouldn't know whether we've got salt water here or whether we've got something else. We're going to look at that in another study, though, the Babylonian account. Of course, their flood account is known as the Gilgamesh epic. But their creation account, which is similar in some regards and diverse in more regards to the Genesis account, is known as Enuma Elish, which is taken from the first word, twin from above. That's what the English means, Enuma Elish, twin from above. But regardless of whether you've got your Sumerian or Babylonian or Akkadian or Assyrian flood stories or creation account, the Christian believes that the writers of the Holy Scriptures were borne along or moved or carried by the Holy Ghost whenever they wrote these things down. That would rule out whether they picked something up from the Babylonians. Now, back to Genesis 1:2. We're looking at the fivefold description. Fourthly, I said it's covered with water. First of all, we see this in the word tehom. Secondly, we see it in the word mayim, which is the word for waters, the last word in Genesis 1:2. Evidently, what we've got here at the beginning is a spherical earth. It has the shape of a sphere, similar to what we know that it has today. Composed of gas, water, and solid particles